Welcome to another episode of Lips Garage. Today we're going to be back on the 66 Impala. We've done a couple of maintenance items, now we're going to do some upgrades. So again, here's the engine. It's going to be a factory 283 cubic inch, and it's going to be part of a 2-speed power glide. So as I've shown in other videos, this is the original engine that would have come in the prior 66 that we were working on. Although when we had gotten it, somebody else had switched it and I had switched it, and we had different plans for that. Eventually this will get upgraded to a larger engine. But for today, we're gonna focus on switching out the intake from the 2-barrel to a 4-barrel, which is gonna change the carburetor as well. Put some little flashier on for an air cleaner. Might do something different with the valve covers. Valve covers will not be any performance difference, obviously, in this particular aspect. It's just gonna be cosmetic. And we'll probably take a look at switching out to the aluminum radiator that we'd gotten for the other one. While I'm at it, I may be attacking the exhaust. At this point, it is plumbed into a single exhaust. I do have some dual exhaust pipes from the other vehicle. Might upgrade the mufflers on that. We'll see how far I get in this particular project. For this one, I am going to leave the hood up. I will try and get some better lighting so we can see what's going on. The springs do sag just a touch, but I'll get some better lighting as we go along. With the air cleaner out of the way, we can see a little more of what we're dealing with. So again, this is going to be just a factory 2-barrel, and it's going to be how many jets, how much airflow, and ultimately how much fuel flow that the engine can take. The engine being a giant air pump, the more air you can get in, the more air you can get out, is going to make everything run more efficient, more powerful. Coupled with that is going to be the presence of fuel, atomizing fuel, the better distribution you can get. So all that, depending on the needs of your vehicle or the desires of your project, you may or may not need to do this. One of the biggest issues that most people do when they're building an engine is what they call over-carburation. You do not need a huge carburetor to make an engine run efficiently or more powerful. Making sure that everything is tied in together. Being a 283, it's not going to be a huge displacement engine. 4-barrel won't be necessary for an extreme amount of performance because the size of the engine is going to be limited. Although in this particular instance, it is going to give us a better sound out of the exhaust. It's going to give us better cosmetics and maybe a little bit more performance, but not outrageously so. Most of these are being done simply because we have the parts already. I'm not investing anything other than time in this. One of the other things we're going to be doing that I did fail to mention is upgrading the distributor to an HEI distributor. So this is still going to be an antiquated system with points. When they're adjusted and when they're tuned up, they run just fine. They're pretty reliable for just a regular driver. The thing I like about HEI is you can run a hotter coil, so you can run a hotter plug, and you're going to get better performance and better efficiency just due to the higher voltage out of the HEI. Again, a lot of what I'm going to be doing is going to be for cosmetic reasons. So we're going to start by draining the coolant out of the vehicle. We're also going to do drain the oil. To do the intake and some of the other things we're doing, and obviously doing the radiator, we want to get rid of all that. I have recently flushed and changed the hoses on this, so I know the coolant is in pretty good shape, but coolant is cheap enough, and for cheap insurance, I'm going to be probably flushing the system again, ensuring I've got everything at the right freeze point and whatnot. The vehicle itself will not be run in the winter time, other than the occasional startup, just to make sure everything is okay. So I'm not really overly concerned about the freeze point, but I do want to make sure that the protection is where it needs to be. So once I've got that drained and get the radiator out, I will start disassembling the top end of it. Before I am through with this engine, I very well may put a camshaft in it. At that point, I will be removing the front end, maybe updating the water pump while I'm at it. Run it reliably for a while before we get into the larger engine. While that's draining, we were gifted a 350 4-bolt engine from my daughter's high school shop teacher. Something they had laying around and thought it'd be cool to incorporate her love of the shop. She's into welding and creative metals, and the love of the vehicle. So this ultimately is going to be the next engine we put in once I get it machined and assembled. From here, I'll go either to a big block. You know, we've been taking a look at doing an LS swap, and all those I'll feature on the show as we go along. Again, while we're waiting for the coolant to drain out, I'll start disassembling some of the top end stuff. Start by removing the upper radiator hose, obviously. Disconnected the coolant temp sensor. We're definitely going to want to put that into the new vehicle, or onto the new intake, I'm sorry. I'll start by removing the ignition coil, get everything removed and ready to move for the distributor. Possibly start taking off the valve covers, take off the fuel line, the emissions line, and all that, get everything ready to get taken care of. One thing you'll want to keep in mind is where everything is disconnected. I've mentioned that in previous videos. That's always been my Achilles heel, is trying to remember how things go back together, because I'll get started on it, it'll be months and months and months later. This is a project I hope to have done in a matter of days. The biggest thing is going to be this here, the grounding strap from the engine to the body, and then the body to the ground. And again, whatever electronics you disconnect, coolant temp sensor, there may be an oil pressure sensor, depending where that's at. Just make sure where everything is connected, because when you put it back together and fire it up, you don't want to run the risk of damaging anything because you forgot to hook something up. Pictures, documentation, all that is going to be wonderful. I've got the pretty good video going back and forth, so I'll have plenty to refer to if I need to. So while you're disassembling, organization is key. I've said that in other videos. One of the things that I do like to use are just these cheap little, not quite Tupperware, but little Rubbermaid totes. You can usually get them at Walmart, Menards, wherever. 10 packs, like 10 bucks. So all my smaller pieces I'll do in these. If I'm doing a bigger job, then you can label each one, engine, suspension, whatever. Larger parts are a little easier to identify, obviously. I generally just sit near the vehicle, and then I've got larger totes, something like that guy there, to keep different parts in. So as long as you know where things came from, you know where they go back, and you can find them when you're reassembling, everybody's going to have their own way to go about it. Alright, now we've got the alternator loose. We don't have to completely remove it because the main bracket does not attach to the intake or anything, but the secondary, I already got it off, sorry. The adjustment bracket does attach. So I've got that guy removed, and the adjustment arm, that's off. The main pivot does not have to be removed because we're not going that far into it. Next, again, we don't have to remove the carburetor because I'm taking off the entire intake. But you take off the throttle arm, the transmission kickdown cable, step around to this side. We've already taken off the fuel filter. I've got the vacuum advancement on the carburetor, or excuse me, the distributor. We're going to be removing the distributor and changing that HEI style. So we're going to remove all the spark plug wires. Now, if you were just changing the intake and keeping the distributor, obviously you'd want to do a better job of marking which wire went to where, so you could just plug it back in. But because I'm changing everything, I'm not concerned about it. I will reset the vehicle to top dead center, and I'll run all new wires to the proper location on the distributor once I get it in. Again, we've got the vacuum advance disconnected. We've got the heat riser disconnected. So once I pull the ignition coil off, I should be set to pull the distributor off, and then I can start working the bolts to actually take the intake off. The radiator is still draining, taking its time. I do have the upper hose off. I do have the cap off, so it is just gravity bleeding right now. But again, it's just doing its thing, give enough time to get the side work done. Now, I've got the old distributor out, and as I said, if I was just putting everything back together and just doing maintenance, you'd want to index where the distributor was sitting in the vehicle as it sat to make sure you had an opportunity to put it back where it went and you don't have a whole lot of tuning issues or run the risk of reinstalling it wrong. Again, I'm completely switching it out. One thing you do want to make sure of, though, is that this little gasket here, let me get a better hand on it. This little gasket here will make one heck of a mess if you do not get it back on. I'm not going to reuse this one. I'm going to replace the gasket, but it seals up here where the distributor goes. The distributor in this case does drive the oil pump, so you have oil all up inside that shaft there, as you can see after I pull it out. I'm dripping on the floor a little bit. So without this, that's going to shoot oil all over your engine. It's a messy, messy, messy pig if it's missing, and in the wrong situation, it can take you quite a while to figure out where that's coming from. Make sure when you drop your new distributor in that has been replaced. Again, we're down to the last couple pieces before I can take the intake off. We've got the heat riser there, although that should come off with the whole intake. We've got a couple other, there's that most likely going to be the oil pressure. Get a little better shot of it, the sensor there. This is going to be for the distributor. We'll get into that on reinstall. Here's that sensor. We are going to reuse those sensors because they are operating fine. So no sense in spending money where you don't need to on something like that. Although that one is a bugger enough to get, I might just go ahead and switch it so I know everything is new on that one. Coolant temp sensor, if that fails, it's 2 minutes to change. Not a big deal on these nice old engines. But otherwise, I'm about at the point where I can start taking out the intake. I'm going to finish letting the radiator do its thing. We're going to take the radiator out, get that switched over to a pretty unit, get the valve covers off. So I should be fully disassembled here in the matter about the next 20 minutes. As I've said multiple times, when you're planning a project, make sure you've got all the information you need. In this case, a 283 is typical small block Chevy, very similar 305, 350, what have you. But anybody that says a small block is a small block is a small block doesn't know what they're talking about. There are many design changes throughout the years. So pay important attention to things like your valve cover bolts. You got some that are perimeter. Are they 2 on each side? Are they 3 on each side? Are they center bolt? When you're looking at, assuming that the engine wasn't original to the car, you have a car block or truck block. The year makes a difference. The starter placement. Some of them are going to bolt in horizontally. Some of them are going to bolt in vertically. Some of the starters are offset. Some of them are straight side by side. Water pump rotation. If it's an older vehicle with a V-belt, it's going to rotate one direction. If it's a newer vehicle with a serpentine belt, the water pump's going to rotate in a different direction, even though they will physically bolt up. So make sure you do your research. Make sure you fully understand what you're working on, because it can lead into some big issues down the road if you're taking somebody else's word for it that may not exactly know what they're talking about. All right, so it's a couple days later. I've decided on the intake I'm going to use. This one here, hard to read, but it's an Edelbrock Performer. It is a 4-barrel, what they call a dual plane. You can see the dual chambers here. And without getting too much specifics for today, it has to do with how it feeds the individual runners into the engine. So the other one I had a 4-barrel, what they call a torquer, which is a single plane. There's a lot more that goes into it, but a single plane is going to be a lot better in a higher RPM application, like on a racing engine or something that lives up high. This one being a street vehicle, the dual plane is going to give you more power, more performance, more reliability on the lower end. So this is one that I pulled off of a donor engine that we had. Needs a lot of cleanup. This one's also what they call a spread bore carburetor. So here's wider than here. I do have an adapter for that. The carburetor that we have is a square bore. I'll get into that a little more later. But got some gaskets to clean up, got some surface clean up. Some for cosmetics, some because you don't want to get junk running down in there. Also, I don't know how long it's been since this is run, so I'm going to run some flush through and make sure I don't have any mouse nest or any buildup in any of the runners before I put it back onto the engine. Yeah, dual plane Edelbrock Performer RPM. I spent some time cleaning it up as best as I could, doing some polishing, getting all the dirt and everything out of the way. I did give it a freshen up with some aluminum engine paint, high heat engine paint, just for visibility. Again, I got it cleaned up as much as I could, but still has some discoloration. I do have that spread bore to square bore adapter on. I do have recessed cap head screws. And then I've got the studs on for the carburetor, because obviously we've got a little bit of space to make up the difference. I'm going to make sure everything's good and clean, make sure everything's sealed, make sure your bolts are as tight as you need to be. This will definitely create vacuum leaks if you don't do it correctly. So now that I've got this cleaned up and ready to install, I'm going to take a look at all the different fittings on the factory intake manifold, and we will see what needs to come over and what kind of mounts and whatnot I'm going to be able to use. So this here is going to be the thermostat coolant outlet. So I'll clean that up, maybe get some paint on that. This here is going to be one of the sensors I need to use. The aftermarket intake is going to have a little bit different layout. So this sensor will come out, that one will go in and make sure it links up with my harness. The older point style is going to have a separate ignition coil. I'm not going to need to run that. There is a vacuum piece there. It's going to hook up to a line though. It should be slightly different than the one I'm using. Take a look at the other side. Everything else is pretty straightforward. There is an adapter here for a port, and I will have to hook that up to the new carburetor, which should have a port that will match that. So just a couple other pieces here to make sure that the new one is ready to go, especially the stuff that I need to do in the back makes it a little more difficult once it's installed. Taking a look up underneath the hood. I still have to pull out the radiator yet. That's going to give me a little more clearance to do what I need to do. I've got just a little bit of cleanup left to do on the engine block itself before I lay down the gaskets and how to seal that. So a little bit of cleanup, and I'll have this thing about ready to plop on. All right, we're at the last step for test fitting. So we want to make sure that the intake is indeed going to fit. I did that part already, made sure that the bolt holes lined up. Next, we're going to take a look at the gaskets themselves. A lot of them will say this side up. The part number themselves are the same, so it doesn't matter which side that it goes on to. Want to make sure that, get down in here, that our gasket channels, our bolts, everything lines up the way that it needs to, which we've got here. Everything is right where it needs to go. We've got our water jackets, we've got our actual intakes. And then at the end of it, what they call the China rail, we do have the silicone gaskets here. There's a lot of love-hate relationship with these guys, and a lot of it comes down to, in my opinion and stated as such, the amount of gap that you need to cover. This particular intake gasket set from Felpro does give you that distributor gasket that I was talking about earlier. So when you get your intake on, once you have everything going, get it right up here. So you want to take a look at this gap here. If you're resting on there and you're a pretty tight tolerance, which is going to happen with most of your factory blocks and factory heads and everything, you're okay just to use an RTV on that bead seal. If you have a bunch of aftermarket components, maybe the heads are a little bit different angle the way they're machined, or maybe you've got a different type of intake and you have a gap there, then you'd run a different kind of gasket like this. A lot of folks are still using the quart gasket. So really pay attention before you start just schmutzing stuff on. Make sure you do your test fitting, everything fits the way it wants to. Now the next step, again, there's some arguments here. What I have done in the past, and has always worked for me, everybody's kind of got their own. We've got our water jackets. We want to make sure they don't leak. That's how you get coolant into the oil. Got just a little bit of cleanup in that one to go there. So put a small bead of silicone, not silicone, RTV. Put a small bit around the water jackets, and then put the gasket on, and then put another small bead around the water jacket where the intake's going to go. You put about a 1/4 inch bead around your China rails, both front and rear, and then let it sit for just a moment. You want it to get a little bit tacky. You don't want to throw it on right away, but you don't want to let it sit for a long time either. So there is kind of a sweet spot for it. Make sure all your surfaces are good and clean, which I've done. Take a solvent, make sure there's no oil residue, anything that's going to keep that gasket from doing its job, or you're going to have to rip this entire thing apart and go over it again. So I've got a little bit of cleanup. Looks like I've got some paint flecks down there I want to take care of. Got a couple of paint flecks here. I'm not too worried about that right now because that's not going to get covered. But once I get the cleanup done, we'll run those beads, get the gaskets on, and we'll be ready for our plop. All right, so I've got the gaskets placed where I want to. I've got my sealant down. I'm waiting for it to tack up a little bit. not my best job. This is a little more difficult to do when the engine is in the car for some reaching. But you got one continuous bead. You got the dollops in the corners where the gaskets hit. And we're just waiting for it to tack up. Now, the one thing I like about Fords versus GMs, a lot of your intake bolts are at an angle. So they do, the bolts actually sit like this in the engine, where a lot of your Fords bolts sit that way. So when you have, like the Ford ones, you can put a threaded stud in there, and you can actually use that to guide yourself down on your intake holes, intake bolt holes, to make sure you get a good even drop right where it needs to be. You don't want to set your intake down and then have a bunch of movement left and right to get it set. The industry calls it the plop. You want to be able to just drop it, crank it down, and seal it. So a little more difficult with GMs, but when you got the touch, you got the touch. Sometimes it does take practice, but that's part of the test fitting. You want to make sure things are sitting right where they need to be. So not something I can show with a one-handed video. I do apologize. Better equipment is coming. But that's my next step to get my intake on the plop. Plop. So I've got some mock-up going. Got the intake installed. Still working on getting the old coolant temp sensor out. That's going to take me a minute. I'm having issues with that guy. I do have the carburetor mocked up. I do have the valve covers that we're planning on using on. Now, what we're going to run into some issues is a difference in an aftermarket versus factory carburetor. So we've got the ignition linkage here. Get the return spring out of the way here. So we've got the throttle linkage, which won't be too bad. We'll just have to find the right spot, most likely that nozzle there. So when we pull on, we're good to go. So this lower part here is going to be part of the transmission. Now I need to make sure I've got that thing hooked up right, because depending on if you're at light throttle, if you're at full throttle, whatever, that's going to change the shifting pressure. There's more technical ways of describing it. But basically, you're going to have an easy shift at part throttle, you're going to have a more firm shift at full throttle, and it's going to use the throttle position to make those adjustments. So I've got a couple different kits to see if I can keep the factory rod for that, or if I'm going to have to go to an aftermarket cable setup. As far as the throttle goes, throttle's pretty simple. We want to be able to hit the gas pedal, pull the lever back, and we want to make sure we get all the way to wide open throttle with the adjustments that we have. Again, I will make sure that I can use that. If I can't use the factory one, then they do have some aftermarket options available. Valve covers are pretty simple. We've got the style we chose. We had a few of them to look at. We'll get a breather and an oil fill here. This guy here is most likely going to go to a PCV valve on the back, just to make sure we're running the way we need to. Thermostat outlet, and we'll have the top end put together, not a problem. I'm going to leave this valve cover off because we do need to set the vehicle at top dead center on the compression stroke to set in the the distributor. Best way to do that is to remove the spark plug from the #1 cylinder, crank it over until you feel pressure coming out. You know, the old thumb test, put the thumb over the hole, either crank it with a key or bar it over until you feel that pressure. And then you can get a zip tie or a straw or something like that that won't get broke or stuck. And then you can actually see how far the piston is moving. You want that to be at top dead center so you can set up your distributor. So that'll be what I'm working on next. All right, it's been a couple weeks and life does what it does. I'm able to get back onto the project. I am in the other garage. We got it shoved over. We got the radiator out. I've got the fan off. I've got everything else disconnected I needed to. I got the spark plugs out, which actually look to be in pretty good shape. I won't reuse them, but it's promising to know that they were in good shape. I am at the point where I'm gonna drop the distributor in. So I was able to rotate. Instead of having the center crank bolt, they do have the harmonic balancer bolts or the pulley bolts. I was able to get on that, and it's spun free enough that was able to get me where I needed to be. Again, put my thumb over the spark plug hole on the #1 cylinder, got me to the compression cycle on that particular cylinder. And looking down at the timing mark, I am at 0. So I know where I want to be. Looking at the distributor, we find out which one is the #1 cylinder. As far as the distributor goes, pardon me while I get things figured out. So that would be that one. And then marking the base for here. That's going to be where I want to line up my rotor when I stab it in. As I take off the cap, we want to make sure we've got the rotor pointing at the number 1 cylinder. And when we drop it in, we know that ignition is going to be right where we want it to be. Once we get everything done and get the vehicle running, we're able to do the timing and get it where we full want to be. But setting it 0, top dead center, that's your initial mark. So let me get this stabbed in and get the rest of this put together. So I got a little bit further. We've got the distributor stabbed in. I got the hold down on. I've got the sensor plugged in back there. I got my valve covers on. I ended up going with a set of studs as opposed to just putting regular bolts in. I've always had better luck with those. I am going to run the PCV. Generally, it doesn't matter which side you run these on. I'm going to do my oil fill on that side. I'm going to do my PCV on this side. Just as long as you've got one in there. You can cap it off and just put a breather on, but I like the idea of the PCVs. I've got my exhaust manifold bolted back up. I've got the spark plugs in the other side, and I'm putting the spark plugs in this side. For spark plugs, I am going to use a set of the E3s. I've used them before. The factory application for the 283 is going to be the E352. I mean, I've read the reports, and I've watched the reviews, and I've checked them. They're supposed to make more power and everything. Whether they do or whether they don't in this particular application, I've had good luck with them. They're a pretty decent price, so I generally tend to run them. Otherwise, a regular AC Delco. This one, the factory was an AC Delco 43, which they're not making anymore. I believe the 44 and the 45s are both listed as replacement. Those are going to be heat ranges for what the engine cycles through. You can still find them, but again, I've had pretty good luck with the E3s. They're readily available, so I just went with a set of them. Next, once I get all that done up, I'm going to run my wires. I did get a set of the Excel straight plug wires. Again, I'm going to run them a little bit different from what I had found taking them off. I'm not going to run them through the motor mount like they did from the factory. So these are the cut to length do yourself. They do make special tools for those. If you're really careful, you can just do it with a pair of side cuts and a straight blade. We'll see when I get into that far. That'll be one of the last things I do. I've still got to work on the adjustment on the carb a little bit, make sure I've got full wide open throttle capability. I've got a vacuum line to hook up to the distributor to the carburetor, and I want to research again which one they want to see on that and which one to cap off, just to make sure I'm hooking it up correctly. But should not be a whole lot further till I fire up. A little bit of news on the radiator. This is the aluminum radiator we were putting in the other car. So if I take the spacer out, the radiator will bolt up to the car, and then my hoses are different, and there's quite a bit of gap between the fan and the radiator. You want some gap, but you don't want too much because you want to be able to suck the air through the radiator instead of pulling it around. So all I'm going to have to do is make a little bit of an adapter. I've got about 2 inches clearance I need. That'll put the bracket onto the spacer and then bolt the radiator to the adapter that I'm going to make. That'll probably be the longest point at this part between that and doing the spark plug wires. So that is what I'm up to next. Got a lot of tuning to do, but it's running. And that'll wrap up this episode. I did run into a couple of issues with the reassembly and some of the adjustments that I had once I was putting everything together that I will cover in future episodes. But for today, as always, I appreciate everybody tuning in. Again, feel free to leave a like, leave a comment, anything you want to see in the future, any questions that you have over what I did in this particular series of episodes. We are coming up to the turn of the year in the holiday season, so I wish everybody a very pleasant and a happy, healthy 2023 and a good holiday season, whatever it is that you celebrate. Thanks, everybody.